Hello and welcome to Fearless DIY Music. My name is Tristan Lass, and today I'm once again joined by my dear friend Kevin Gamble. He and I are going to discuss my new album. It will be released on Wednesday of this coming week, January 22nd. It will be available on Bandcamp and all the major streaming platforms. I'm not asking anybody to pay for it, but at least give it a listen, download it, to your iTunes, check it out, and get into the comments section and give me some feedback. There'll be a lot more coming on the album as the release day approaches. But I wanted to talk to Kevin because he's had an advanced listen to it. He's had the album now for about 3 weeks and has had a chance to check it out. And I wanted to field any questions that he has and just kind of get his general take on what he thinks of it. I mean, is it terrible? Does it suck? Is it pretty good? Is it better than my average? And just kind of get some feedback from Kevin. So I'm going to let him take it away, and you can take this in any direction you want. You can ask me specific questions or just give me feedback, whatever we want to do. So go ahead, Kevin, take it away.
Well, cheers, Tris, and thanks for having me on to talk about this. And I want to sort of get into both the technical and the artistic side of it, and maybe start off with would like you to set the stage a little bit, like from a general artistic standpoint. What's the name of this album? Is there kind of a sort of a driving sort of theme or concept that prompted this and that runs through this, or kind of how would you fit this album into the bigger picture, maybe of what you've done and and what it's all about?
Okay. Well, the title of the album is About Time, because it's about time that I put something out. It's been 4 years since my last album, Landed, came out. This album is a reaction against my previous work. Landed is a long concept-driven album of long songs, kind of it's a little bit of a progressive album, but actually what it was supposed to be is to be a concept album, a movie in songs kind of idea. So I got really kind of into the high art area on that album. The lyrical content was met with almost everybody with just like, well, it's a great piece of art, but I'd never want to listen to that again because it's pretty depressing. So what I decided to do with About Time is I decided to go, okay, well, I like prog and I like pop and I like, high energy stuff. But I also love, acoustic music. So what I did was I just condensed everything down into very short form. It was like, okay, my rules on this album were to make the lyrics not depressing, number one, have some fun with them, be kind of playful, still tackling issues, but be playful with it. I wanted to write lyrics that my children could listen to and enjoy listening to, rather than being like either frightened or bummed out. A lot of times I err on the side of going too heavy. So this album, that's the lyrical direction I wanted to go, and I think I achieved that. And then for the musical part of it, I did not dumb down complexity, but I shortened the length of everything. Rather than repeating something 16 times, I repeat it 2 times or 3 times, or maybe 4 at the most. So I really tried to make the songwriting tight and concise. All the songs clock in between the 2:15 to 3:30 mark, and there's 10 of them. So it's a short listen. I wanted to make it easy on the listener. I didn't want to make huge demands of the listener having to fill in the gaps. A lot of times artists, when they make something, you have to, listen to it repeatedly, and all of a sudden your imagination takes hold, and then you begin to fill in those gaps. And what I wanted to do with this is just like, boom, just give you a punch in the face. Here's the idea. Here's all the ideas, concise, fully formed, no big run-ups to solos, no big run-ups to vocals. The vocals on a lot of songs start, boom, the moment the track starts. I wanted to just make it into mini prog songs, but they're just also pure pop is what I'm going for as well, and accessibility. So that was my intent.
Yeah, I think that definitely comes through in the music, and I think you're maybe a little too hard on your last album. I kind of see it as, but you make a good point about how they're sort of bookends in a way. It's like the last album was sort of almost a work of apocalyptic fiction,
Hmm.
but this album almost is like the getting up, dusting yourself off, and it's like, okay, how do we engage with this world? You know, what are the choices we need to make? What are the what are the pitfalls we need to avoid? So it really does have kind of a progressive message as well as the musical aspect you're talking about, and it is a really interesting juxtaposition because even with the songs being this short, there's many of them have almost a linear quality to them. It's not a short song like a Ramones song where it's the same thing, you know, for 2 minutes. It's sort of a 2 minute journey where you've got hooks, you've got verses and choruses, you've got solos, but it's kind of linear where it doesn't keep circling back and circling back. And so even just in a 2.5 minute song, the last third of the song is something completely different from the first third of the song, and so you really feel like you're covering a lot of ground in a short time. It's almost like in some ways, at moments, it almost feels like someone brought Yes into the studio and said, "Okay, you've got to make an album in the format of a
Uh-huh.
Ramones album. You know, see what you can do." But it's fascinating to hear that because there's no wasted time in this. There's no filler in this. There's no repetition in this. In just about half an hour, you cover such a long musical progression. But that makes it, that can be a challenge as well because there are a lot of ideas on this record, from start to finish. So you've talked a bit previously in other videos about some of the technical aspects of this, but
Uh-huh.
maybe just a quick rundown of what some of the primary instruments were that you featured on this album, just like some sort of your main sounds that run throughout the album. Just a quick summary of the highlights of those.
Well, if you want to really boil it all down, it was down to about four, no, five guitars total. I used for all the nylon string parts, I used my vintage Takamine classical guitar. I used my Gibson LGO, my older one from the early 60s, as the primary acoustic guitar. There is a lot of fingerpicking on this album. This is probably the most fingerpicking I've ever done on an album. It's all over the place. And it all turned out really well, I think. And I think that I managed to record it really well. Recorded all the acoustics just using Rode NT5s. No processing whatsoever. There's no compression. There's no reverb. There's nothing. That's just the room sound of those guitars. I used my Epiphone Black Les Paul, the Black Strat, which is the early. We've gone over these guitars before, but the Black Strat, and then the Butterscotch Telecaster. So those five instruments. The other guitars of note would have been my custom Eddie Van Halen thing, the green thing with the Floyd. I had to have that for the solo parts on Long Gun because I do a lot of dive bombing in that song. What else? Nothing that really is worth mentioning. There's a couple other guitars on the album, but other than that, that was it. The bass was all 76p bass, direct into the interface. After going through my compressor, just using a tube compressor, all on the front. So there was no additional processing whatsoever on the bass. The drum machine I used was Hydrogen, and then I used my kit. About 5% of the drums were actually in the room, and I just recorded that with the NT5s once again. I ultimately ended up using a handful of equipment on this whole thing, and that was eye-opening. And now it's making me think, well, if I do decide to downsize, I know what I absolutely have to have at this point, and so everything
Yes.
else is negotiable. Maybe I'll use it in the future, maybe I won't. I'm kind of going through that with my pedals now. I have a video dropping on, that dropped on earlier this week that goes through all of that, and I'll link that down below. But I really think that's all that's of note. You can also ask me about, how I use the DAW if you want to.
Yes, that was one of the technical aspects I wanted to get into because this is a big shift for you in how music is made. You've been, analog and then sort of the digital tape or digital disc version of analog for a long time. So as you've mentioned previously on the channel, this was the shift all the way into the DAW, but not exactly the way most people use a DAW, but carrying the philosophy that you use for recording into the DAW model. And so what struck me listening to the album is sort of an authentic character that didn't become digital music or electronic music making when it shifted over into a DAW based approach. So talk a little bit about kind of catching people up on your approach to using the DAW on this album.
Absolutely. How did it sound sonically to you? Like EQ, compression, all that kind of stuff.
Well, I was going to say that it sounded very live and very authentic, that it did not lose any of the authentic character of the sort of traditional analog approach you've taken. And to take a quick step back, just to make sure I get this in, one of the things I wanted to comment on was that this album, like others you've done, is kind of a bracing, sort of cleanses the sonic palette, because it's like, oh yeah, this is what an electric guitar sounds like. This is what a bass guitar sounds like. It's a very natural sounding album. And I think we've become conditioned to hear the hyper processed version of rock music, where all the individuality of the sound and the tone is kind of swept away in a wave of digital overload. But this one doesn't have that. You've kind of kept the real sound of all the instruments and voices, and somehow even managed to create a drum sound mostly in the DAW that sounds completely authentic to your way of playing drums, yeah, and the tone of your drums and so forth. Still one of the most striking things. It'll be harder for people to appreciate without going back and listening to your previous work, yeah, which they should. But that's definitely one of the most striking things. And with that, you did something that would not be the common thing that people do. Usually people use drums in a DAW, the sequencer in a DAW for hyper precision, but you did something that was kind of the opposite of that to achieve authenticity. So, but I think you had something to say about the sound of these instruments in the recording.
Well, real quick, I'll go through the drum machine. I am going to do a dedicated video on how I go about using a sequencer. What I do is that I bring it all the way to 64th notes, and then I put beats slightly off. And I also use the humanizer, and I managed to find a kit that is just really realistic sounding within my sequencer. So that's how I achieved the drums sounding like it was actually could have been me playing them. So that was really cool. Now, so I just wanted to make it clear that, okay, so you're not hearing any EQ issues or compression issues as you're listening to the album. The album sounds good. It sounds, everything sounds like, it's well balanced and all that kind of stuff. I just want to give me a thumbs up if that's the case.
Yes, yeah, but okay. I think it's definitely a thumbs up in that regard. But I think it's an important distinction to make, that you accomplish that in a very naturalistic way, and not a way that sounds like it has a mountain of plugins dumped on top of it to sound like the wall of guitars from your typical rock album. It kind of strips all that back and allows you to hear. I alluded to Yes and things like that. It's like, we all, I think, remember the way that listening to an album used to be, where you heard the individual character of every instrument, and it didn't sound like every other album, but it still sounded clear and balanced, and you could pick through everything sonically, and it wasn't covered in mud and so forth. So very transparent sound, very natural sound, very authentic sound. That's a word I use a lot on this channel, and that really is in the forefront on this one.
The reason why I keep hammering this away is because I use 0 plugins. I didn't use none. I used no EQ. Everything is as it sounded in the room. I found as I was going through the process, I'm like, oh, well, if that's not sparkly enough, I could go back and get, and EQ it, just using a plugin. And what I kept doing was just adjusting either microphone placement or adjusting my settings on things to get things where they needed to be or the way I wanted them to be. I erred on the side of having my guitars a little bit brighter than I would normally record them, because back in the analog days, I just go boom, hit my board, and just crank the treble a little bit. And I worked more on my vocals on this album than I have on any album. I took my time to get my enunciation and my clarity and my position from the microphone right. I also worked really hard on my background vocals, because what I found is if I could just hit an octave higher, have that buried in the mix behind the main vocal, I didn't have to use any EQ. I achieved all of the sounds by working within the space that I have to get the sounds as close to right as possible. And when it came time to mix, I just wasn't coming across things that I felt needed anything. And by the time I got to like the fifth or sixth track and hadn't used any plugins, I'm like, I'm not going to use any. And I just didn't. So this is just straight up the mastering. I just did Redbook mastering, through the DAW, which is, should bring it, that gives compression, and that does a little bit of EQing when you do the Redbook rendering, and is supposed to make it ready for the airwaves. And I have listened to, I listened to all those tracks after I uploaded them to TuneCore and to Bandcamp, and was very satisfied with the result. You heard the Redbook renderings of the album, and so I used nothing. I used no plugins whatsoever, and I don't know if that's completely unprecedented. Maybe it is by a newbie or somebody who just doesn't want to mess with it, but I honestly felt that the sounds were strong enough on their own that I didn't have to use either the outboard parametric I have or even go into the EQ. I was like, I'm happy with my voice, which never happens. I'm never happy with my vocals. I always go and bury them under reverb, or bury them in the mix, or EQ the living crap out of them. And I didn't feel like I had to do that this time. And part of it is because I did that up front. I did a video on, yes, how I process my vocals up front, and the experiment worked. I did dry wet mix of the same performance on everything, on the background vocals, and then I either picked the dry or the wet or both. I did a lot of creative panning with the vocals and creative stacking. And that just really, all of a sudden, when you've got, 6 vocals to work with, and they're all basically the same, but they have just slightly different characters and things, careful listening and really creative use of panning and just volume dynamics got me where I needed to get. So I used, and was my whole methodology. The bass just sounded good. So, I have trouble mixing bass because that part of my hearing is the hearing that's been hurt the most over the years, because I did a lot of gigs on bass and with a really loud rig, and I've lost a lot of those frequencies. So I had to really be careful with that. I wish I would have brought it up a little bit more in the mix, but other than that, that's my only self-criticism of the technical aspect of the album. But I think the bass probably to most people sounds great, because I just can't hear that stuff anymore. So
so I'm glad you gave that overview, because that kind of ties together a lot of the things that have been discussed on this channel, in your own videos and our chats, about this is just a different approach to building things sonically up front, and we talked a little offline about previously about sometimes the typical approach to the studio of getting the most neutral sound possible, the most isolated, unaffected sound possible, and then kind of relying on the DAW to take care of that later, can actually make things harder. It can actually be more work on the back end to try to pull the character out of a completely neutral, recorded sound. Whereas you got those sounds up front in a live open room. The room we're seeing in this video is where a lot of the recording was done.
All
not
of it.
In an isolation booth.
All of it was recorded in this room.
Yeah, not in an isolation booth, not in a completely sterile environment, but in just in an open space with all kinds of random things around the room. And the result is you had sonic character built in up front and didn't have to spend a lot of time on the back end. The project I'm working on right now, I tried to get that isolated sound as much as possible for a lot of instruments, and it does take more work on the back end. I'm having to spend more time with EQ to kind of restore some of those things that the really neutral setting takes out of it. And so I'm seeing, the other side of that and hearing how effective it can be in creating a really uniquely you approach where every sound on the record has a distinct sonic signature and doesn't just sound like your standard issue Andy Wallace, rock mix or something like that. So yeah, that this is kind of coming full circle with all of these ideas and showing that if you have an artistic voice up front going into a project, lead with that and create something based on that rather than sort of apologizing for that effectively and trying to compensate for it later. But that's definitely pervasive throughout the album. It's the distinct characteristic of every instrument. Sounds natural, sounds live, sounds real, because it is. It wasn't. There's nothing fake about it.
Yeah, and I just don't know how else to work. and the cool thing about it is that and I said this before, and we'll kind of like start wrapping things up here a little bit, but recording this album with the DAW was so easy, on a technical standpoint. I'm not having to jack my I/O, I'm not sitting there with 1/4-inch jacks, to listen to playbacks and all this other stuff. It was so easy, so I did many more takes of everything, which resulted in better performances, which resulted in me listening back and being able to, and with the infinite number of tracks, I could do test tracks, and I could keep safeties. And I would go and I would do something that I could have kept, but I would keep going until I got something better. Or I would hear something in those test tracks and I'd be like, I need to boost the treble on that a little bit. Maybe the guitar has drifted a little too much. Maybe I need a different guitar. Maybe I'm not getting the sound that I want. And so being able to take the time to pick the paintbrushes and pick the colors and not worry about all this craziness, just using the simplicity of a 4-channel interface into the DAW made it so much easier for me just to focus on performance. And I think that's what to my ears, this is the best thing I've ever done from top to bottom, as far as the sonics, as far as the songwriting, and as far as the performances, because I've never done this many takes of things. A lot of the riffs on the album, some of the guitar riffs, they're not easy. And those are all done in continuous takes, and that's just by the fact that I had the time to do it, and I felt comfortable, and I felt like I could do as many as I needed to get it right, and the same with the vocals,
Yeah, and this is a good example of using a digital tool to create something that has more of your humanity in it. It's not relying on shortcuts, digital shortcuts to bypass that. You're using the advantages of the tool to develop your human expression, more takes, refining your performance, changing the way you sing, changing the way you play as you go along, refining these abilities within yourself. And I don't want that to sound too philosophical, but tying back to other discussions we've had about AI and the encroachment of digital on human expression, it's like if everyone followed this approach, they wouldn't sound like you, they would sound more like themselves.
Sound like them.
I think that's what we really need, and that's the big takeaway when I hear this record, is just like, this is the way to go to reclaim the humanity in music. Is don't shortcut your artistic voice using the digital tool. Use what the tool allows you to do to develop your strengths and really get them across on a record. And then if everybody does that, then we've got human music again, and the more of that, the better.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Kevin, so much for discussing this with me. And just one final thing, I was fully prepared to dive into plugins if I felt I had to. But what I ended up doing was, if I heard something that was wrong, I just re-recorded it. I've been down the road of fixing things in mixes way too many times, and this was a pleasure because I was happy enough with all the performances that all I had to do is just lay things out on the palette, with panning and volume dynamics, and it was just a joy to do. And I hope that it's a joy for anybody who takes the time to take a listen to it. The album is called About Time. I am Tristram Lass. You put those two things into, a search engine on Wednesday, and it will come up. If you go to your iTunes, if you go to Spotify, wherever it is that you like to listen to music, it will be available. And please, if you take a listen, leave some comments. Let's hear what you think about it. If you made it this far into the video, a like and a subscribe and a share would be greatly appreciated. Kevin and I really enjoy doing this, and we can't wait to be back in a couple weeks with another episode of Conversation with Kevin. You take care, hit subscribe, and we'll see you next time.